It's another episode of Film Streak. I am on a run. I am on a run. This streak, this thing started as like just seeing how many movies I could watch and try and do one a day and keep track of them and talk about them. But I am on a run lately. What can I tell you? I've been watching all these movies for the last 3 years now. And here this year, I took a trip and because, I was listening to music, a lot of music on the road, driving in the car, I found myself kind of coming back to Pink Floyd. And it's not that I really was into Pink Floyd in the first place, but I found myself kind of digging into some of the albums, and really trying to understand them. I think, I first heard about Pink Floyd maybe back in the late 80s and 90s, but that was, as I understand it now, that was them on the way out. Like the days had come and gone for Pink Floyd. So that kind of kicked me off into this thing of like, I want to see, there's got to be like some documentaries or something about the band and the history of their music and all that. So I did end up finding one called Whatever Happened to Pink Floyd, The Strange Case of Gilmour and Waters. And I think you can find it on like Amazon Prime or Tubi maybe. And it's a pretty interesting look at the whole band, starting from their early days in the 60s with Syd Barrett and the sound that they had, but then how that started to evolve. And Syd Barrett leaves the band, and then things change. And then they hit the concept albums with The Wall, or even before that, The Dark Side of the Moon. And that style of music, that whole period in music is such a unique thing. And yet, I found some other documentaries because I just got into this mode of like, you know what? I just want to look at music. I'm going to look at the history of music from this period. So I found a bunch of others. I mean, there's one called The Bee Gees, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? I found one called Thriller 40, which is about Michael Jackson and the Thriller album at the 40-year anniversary. I think it was last year. And the whole development of that, but also the history and the context and how it broke some barriers and really kind of changed the landscape of popular music. But aside from that, even there's one called Yacht Rock, a documentary. I think that's the most recent one. And that goes into the whole era from the 70s into the 80s, starting with Steely Dan and their influence on so many different musicians and how that became a whole scene, whether it's like Loggins and Messina to, Toto or Christopher Cross, all these different groups, right? And one that was interesting that I can't really say I'm a fan necessarily, but it is intriguing to me is there's a documentary called The Day the Music Died, and it's about the song American Pie and the songwriter Don McLean, and not only his background and his history with music, but the impact that the tragedy of the plane crash that kills Richie Valens, Buddy Holly, and the Big Bopper, like what that effect had on him and the country and the culture, right? And how he was kind of toiling away, trying to have a music career, and hit upon this idea of, let me work out some of my feelings and some of my grief in song, in music. And he wrote this song. And the documentary goes into the sort of journey of that, right? Of having an idea and finding ways to connect it. And then even tying into the issues of the time, right? Like commenting on life in the 60s, especially in the late 60s when things really got out of hand. And not only that, but the influence that song has had and the impact, right? It has become a very kind of a American song. I mean, it symbolizes so much, but it doesn't hang on a very specific time. It feels pretty timeless. So that was an interesting documentary. I can't really say I'm a big Don McLean fan necessarily. That's the only song of his that I know. But I think the idea that one song could have such an impact and be so lasting I think it's a really interesting thing to document. The one about the Bee Gees, I got to say though, that was one that was kind of eye opening because I didn't realize, I know the Bee Gees from like the 70s, the Saturday Night Fever disco era. I didn't realize they had a whole previous sort of life and success as a band that was, in the late 60s and, even struggling through the early 70s, trying to still kind of stay relevant, but they were like on par with like the Beatles in that era. And I didn't know that about the Bee Gees. I thought they really kind of just hit in the late 70s and they were a disco group. But it is funny to watch that moment. Like you have interviews with all of the Bee Gees at different points. I mean, the only one that's still alive today is, I think Barry is the last one alive, but you do get clips of them talking about their experiences and how they eventually found this sound. Like it is so unique to them. And I think the song was Nights on Broadway. I think that was the song that really cracked the code for them. But, there's so many songs that they had in that era that for me, as someone who grew up as a child in the 80s, still catching some of the lingering effects of the disco era with some of those songs, like I didn't realize how many Bee Gees songs I knew. That was crazy. And then to kind of see the influence that they've had over the years. Another one that was, it was kind of intriguing. I wanted to watch this because it had a very specific angle. Michael DeBarret, Who Do You Want Me to Be? Now, this is about Michael DeBarret, who is a musician, but also an actor. And I probably knew him first as an actor. He'd been in some films, he'd been in TV, and he's got a face that he usually plays like the villains or somebody that's kind of nefarious or suspect or whatever. And I didn't really realize that he had a whole music career until about maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. It was somewhere in there. I can't peg it at this point, but there was a period here in the last 10 years, let's say, where I found this group called Silverhead. And to me, it was like, wait, how have I never heard of this group? It was a group from like the early 70s, and they had a very kind of distinct rock sound and reminded me a little bit of something like T-Rex or maybe something like the Stones. And it felt kind of trashy, kind of like glam and kind of blues, but kind of trash too, I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean it has a very kind of sleazy vibe to it, right? I was looking up history of the band because I'm like, how have I never heard of this band? And I found the lead singer in this is Michael DeBarret. And when I saw pictures of him, I was like, I've seen this guy. I've seen him in movies before. And so I looked that up. And then to find this documentary now, I was like, wait, okay. This really explains it, kind of lays it all out. Like, here's somebody who wasn't really a great musician, wasn't really a great actor. His first role was in To Sir with Love, I think, was at the late 60s. And kind of just was chasing fame, chasing notoriety, not necessarily hung on to like being a master musician or a master actor, but just being a presence. And it's funny because the film, the documentary includes a lot of interviews with him and a lot of people who were in his life. And he doesn't shy away from it, of being like a little bit superficial in his pursuits and, how those things kind of went astray for him at certain times. But I still think it's an interesting look at somebody who's trying to be successful and find some sort of fame, but they're doing everything they can. I mean, the hustle is there. That's the thing I took away, is like the man has got hustle. Speaking of another one that's all about hustle is it's a documentary called Bitchin, The Sound and Fury of Rick James. Now, I think a lot of people know who Rick James is, and a lot of people probably also know Rick James got into some trouble. So he was a messy dude. But I think this documentary, it kind of opened my eyes in terms of how long it took him to even find the success to become Rick James that we know. You know, this documentary goes into a lot of his early career and trying to put bands together and trying to find his own lane and find his own sound, and eventually just really finding that perfect mix of like funk and rock and punk attitude and stage presence, and became the Rick James we know. And then it, of course, also goes into how all of that stuff just went off the rails. And that's kind of a hard thing to watch. I mean, if you know, if you only know Rick James from the Dave Chappelle show skit, I mean, that's unfortunately, that's not an indication of his proudest moment or proudest achievements, but it is a part of what happened in his life. And this documentary goes into that, talks about a lot of his troubles, a lot of his legal issues and personality issues, and how those things all caught up with him. And unfortunately, it has a tragic ending. You know, some of these stories of musicians and artists who they fly too close to the sun, right? And it doesn't last. And but yet this is another one, this Rick James documentary. This one has so much music that, I mean, it's undeniable. Like the either the talent or the craftsmanship or the vision, it's just there. And another one here that it kind of gets into the showmanship and the artifice of the music industry is this documentary Milli Vanilli. And this is just from 2023, but this goes into the whole thing of Milli Vanilli. If you don't know, this was in the 90s where this music producer basically put together an album or put together a song. And then he basically got these two guys who were trying to be successful. They were trying to be musicians. They were trying to be dancers. He got them to be the front of this music act without them being the actual vocalists on the song, without being the performers. They had stage presence, they had energy, they had youth, but they were not the people who sang the song. And as luck would have it, this thing that kind of was a scam, it eventually became such a success. It became a runaway hit. And then they needed to put together a whole album, and they just kind of kept the whole charade going. And then when they got to the Grammys, that's when it all broke, because it's like that is something that we're talking straight fraud now. I mean, not only the fact that, yeah, you sold millions of albums, but you've been achieving all this success and you've reached the pinnacle, so to speak, with the industry's top award, right? So this is an interesting look at the sort of the explosive nature of success, right? And how it can get away from you, and how if you don't stay true to yourself or stay true to reality, even, it will all catch up with you in the end. And eventually, you know, the two guys, Rob and Fab, Rob ends up dying, passing away. And Fab, who is still around, and as the documentary shows, he's a big part of it. And a lot of this is told through his point of view about how he kind of got caught up in it and didn't know how to get himself out of it and struggled with a lot of it. And to the point where now these days, it seems like he has at least made some sort of peace with it and even tries to own a little bit of it. But it's an interesting look at the real sort of dark side of the music industry when it is exploitative, right? It takes advantage of people who just are just hungry. They just want to do something fun and cool and new, and they get caught up in the whirlwind. Now, another documentary I saw that is about another type of whirlwind that is kind of set upon artists or a scene is this documentary called Hype. And this is about the kind of the beginnings of the grunge era, right? The grunge scene in Seattle specifically. And how all of these bands, they had kind of just been doing a thing. Like it's just a local scene, groups that a lot of people would probably recognize much later, and maybe even still today, they were just all buddies and kind of revolving around each other in this area and doing their thing, you know, just trying to do music, just trying to be creative and express themselves, but not really bigger aspirations necessarily. And then it just catches on. Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Nirvana eventually breaks the whole world open for it. And then it becomes commercialized and it becomes diluted. And, you know, there's a lot of artists, there's a lot of musicians in the documentary that are talking about the challenge of that, of like, how do we stay true to what we're trying to do? But all this is getting co-opted now. It's becoming corporate. And then you almost want to just run the other way. And as somebody who grew up in that era and saw a lot of those bands coming around, and, you know, I'm trying to do the math of like, when did I first hear of Nirvana? It wasn't the year that they broke. It was like the following year. And so it kind of gives you a picture of how things traveled at that time. You know, it just doesn't work that way anymore necessarily, but it was interesting to piece together like when things were happening and where they were happening. Another one that is another documentary I saw. Well, actually, I want to get into three of these all at the same time, really. There's one called Gimme Danger, Murder in the Front Row, and there's a documentary here about Randy Rhoads, Reflections of a Guitar Icon. And all three of these are about these personalities and groups and artists that kind of like hype. They're just doing their thing and they're trying to find their own lane, find their voice and get some traction and do something new. And eventually they just like hit pay dirt, right? And Gimme Danger, it's all about Iggy Pop, the Stooges, their whole journey through those early days and trying to find a spot in the scene as it existed, but then quickly just turning into their own thing, becoming like the wild dog of the music industry, and often being kind of troublemakers and being seen as like, oh, well, you know what? Stay away from this. Like, this is dangerous music. This is dangerous type of behavior, all that stuff. Hence the title, Gimme Danger, right? And yet, it also goes into the sort of effects that the Stooges and Iggy Pop directly had on the music industry. You know, a lot of the sort of beginnings of the punk scene and even the heavy metal scene, you know, their sound, their vibe, it just changed so many ways that people see rock music. And I think it's the effects you still feel today, I think, even though rock as a genre isn't all that successful or as big as it used to be, at least. I think you can trace it back to this. You can trace it back to all the groups and all of the music that's in Murder in the Front Row, which is about the early days of like the Bay Area music scene, the metal scene with like Metallica's in there, groups like Exodus, the sort of community that is coming out of that scene it's building into something new. You have Kill 'Em All that comes out in the early 80s, and then you have Megadeth that follows after that. You know, and that's the cool thing is this documentary, it shows a lot of the people. I mean, Metallica, I think most people would probably know like who that is. Like you might even know who Dave is and how he turned into Megadeth, but all the other groups outside of that, like you may be a little cloudy on who's who. And this documentary really lays it out like year by year or milestone by milestone, who was involved, where they were involved, and what band and what sound was happening. And I thought this was really great. I mean, it's a great like starting point if you're like kind of new to metal or you've always kind of listened to it, but you don't really know maybe all the bands or all the members of the bands. This kind of lays it out, gives you a good context and a real history of the beginnings of it. Randy Rhoads, that documentary, one, it's interesting because it follows a similar thing where it talks about his early days and coming up with Quiet Riot and them just trying to figure it out, trying to find a spot, you know, find their sound, find a spot, find some sort of success. And it kind of happens, but then he leaves and goes to work with Ozzy. And when he gets to Ozzy's first album, that's when, oh, everybody knows who this guy is. Like everybody, not just the local people in his scene, but the world. And he gets to the second album, but then we get to the point where this is the only thing I really knew about Randy Rhoads is he died too soon. He died in a plane crash. That's all I knew. I didn't even know the details of that. And this documentary goes into it and goes into the sort of effect that that had on the people around him, people in the bands, the family, the friends, but also like the people that have come after, you know, the people that he influenced. And I got to say, if you don't know much about Randy Rhoads, the sort of young genius, the real talent that he had, this will at least give you a better understanding of that, because you not only got some interviews with him from the day, but you've got a lot of archival footage of concerts and performances, and you get to see it really in motion, you know, because this is something that we would probably never get a better view of, is his work and how it contributed to, whether you want to call it heavy metal or just rock in general, or just the idea of a guitar hero. This is it. So the last one, speaking of guitar heroes, the last documentary I want to talk about here is it's called Life in 12 Bars. It's about Eric Clapton. And here's another artist, another musician, another creative force that I only kind of knew. You know, I knew, I guess, the 80s era Clapton. You know, that's what I kind of heard growing up. And I knew that he was in a band called Cream. And I feel like I knew he had done like some work for like movie soundtracks or scores. But I didn't really know much more than that. Now, over the years, I kind of picked up little things like, oh, he was also Derek and the Dominoes. He was also involved with a lot of like blues musicians and their music. But I didn't understand the whole history of the man. And this documentary really goes there. I mean, it really lays out his beginnings, his sort of family issues, and how those things influenced his approach to music, his approach to songwriting, even his approach to how he handled his life. And that's one thing this doesn't shy away from. There are points in his life where things really got rough. He turned to drugs. He turned to alcohol. It kind of was going off the deep end. But I think the interesting thing is that it also shows how music and a sort of a recommitment to your work and to your craft can save you. It can pull you out of a dark place. And, you know, there are a couple of points in this film where it really strikes like an emotional nerve. You know, a lot of these other documentaries, they're fun because you get to see the music, or you get to see the musicians and hear the music and reflect and learn maybe about the era and things that were happening at the time. But this one with Eric Clapton, I got to say, this one really struck some nerves because it is dealing with some very deep kind of emotional issues and trauma that this man has gone through. And yet it's come out in the work, which makes it more palatable. But when you see and hear it just straight, it's heartbreaking. And I mean, especially probably the most tragic thing that happened to him is his son dying at, I think it was like 6 years old. And the idea that all the things that he had gone through in his career, in his personal life, in his family, and this of all things to happen, such a loss. And you think, well, there's no coming back from this. Like, you're done. You're cooked. And there's a moment, it's towards the end of the documentary, but we do get to see how he finds a way. And it's a beautiful moment. It's a beautiful, you know, this is where he comes up with the song Tears in Heaven. And at the time, you know, I remember hearing the song and I feel like I knew that it had something to do with his son, but I was kind of cloudy on like what exactly even happened, but also how this exactly related, you know? And this at least kind of connects some of the dots there. And I think it makes it even more emotionally impactful. So, the thing I take away from a lot of these documentaries is that music, it's its own thing. It's its own kind of creative expression and form. And yet these documentaries show how the people behind music, the people behind the songs or the songwriting, they have lives that aren't just being musicians. They are lives that are informing the work, right? And I feel like, of course, we know that, but to see it kind of laid out a little more plainly and maybe even moment by moment, it helps understand the creative process, like the creative mindset that goes into the work. And that sometimes I look for that when it comes to films and filmmakers. But here, it's like one step removed. It's like I can appreciate the music over here, but now I can also appreciate the musician in their own right. Maybe they've not done great things in their personal life, but the way that they've tried to change it or come around, especially like, look, someone like Rick James, it's tough. Someone like Michael Jackson, it's tough. I don't know if I can really come around on that one. I'm sorry. Even Milli Vanilli, I'm sure a lot of people, especially at the time, felt like, oh, forget these fools. But they're still people. So what do we do? Do we ignore the music? Do we ignore the people? It's an interesting question, And I think all of these documentaries do some sort of version of that, of making the case, at least. And you can see, like, well, look, they weren't scumbags and the music sucked. I mean, I guess at least we have that. Anyway, man, this is a lot. This is probably the most films I've watched for any single episode of Film Streak, I think. I think this is like 12 films. 12, 13, I don't know. I'll count them out when I put the episode up. But I think all of these, it depends on your taste, maybe. All of these are great watches. The ones that I really, really kind of stuck with are the Eric Clapton one. I really like the Rick James one, even though I feel like I still don't know how I feel about Rick James as some of the things he did in his life, but the music and the hustle and the sort of audaciousness of it, you got to respect, So anyway, that's that for this episode. Until next time, go to filmstreak.com if you want to hear some more episodes. You want to sign up to get these by email if that works better for you. I have a list of all these films on IMDb, so you can kind of add these to your list or find out where to watch them online or even get tickets if you can. And hey man, just rock out and watch something new.